Hello, and welcome to your week 3 YouTube video for Ethics of Nature. So, today we're going to be talking about the second reading by Joshua Green, and we're going to be discussing several different things. So, the first thing to pay attention to is what many of you have already noticed and written about in your blog posts, which is that humans are super social creatures and that we belong to a number of different tribes or groups. Every one of us do. So one way to conceive of this is that we live in the center of a series of concentric circles. And some of these tribes are going to be more important in terms of setting ethical norms than others. But each tribe will have its own set of moral norms that part of being a person is learning and operating according to those norms. So a big part of that is just learning what they are. So we can think of ourselves as belonging to a tight-knit group of friends or a very close-knit family. Some people, have different kinds of relationships with their families that are closer, others less so, depending on their life circumstances. But humans typically tend to form very strong bonds with, over a period of time, with a small group of people. And they think of those as their kind of central group, right? And then there is another concentric circle, which is their relatives and their acquaintances. And then there are these kind of place-based groups that humans belong to, like your village or your neighborhood, sometimes your ethnic group or clan. And then, more broadly, there are affiliations like religious groups, right? Political groups, social groups that have an activist outlook. And all of these concentric circles can touch one another at different points. So it's not strictly speaking close, medium close, further out. So different people can inhabit different points on those different circles. So that's one important step in terms of seeing how these norms are enforced and constructed. So now so that's kind of a beautiful thought, right? Because being social, has its ups and downs, but in many ways, it's a really nice thing. However, there are some downsides. So humans have evolved essentially to be a kind of tribal species. So a lot of our moral instincts have, as Green has shown, evolved to specifically deal with a tribal context. And unfortunately, one of those moral instincts for the world that we live in today is the tendency to make in-groups and out-groups. This is called parochial altruism, which means that humans have a tendency to be very generous, very open, very giving of their time, their material wealth, their emotional caring to those that they feel are part of their group, okay? And there's a word that comes from the Pentateuch, the original Hebrew Bible, which is a shibboleth. In the Bible, there's a story of how, in order to identify who belonged to which tribe, a group of Israelites asked another group to pronounce a word. The word was shibboleth. And because a certain kind of linguistic group pronounced it a certain way, they could detect who belonged to their tribe and who didn't through the pronunciation of this word. And in the story, which is kind of dark, they then massacred, committed genocide on all those who mispronounced the word shibboleth. Now, whether this is historically accurate or not is unknowable. But like a lot of ancient texts and ancient stories, it reveals something fundamental about human social organization. And now we have adopted this word shibboleth in our lexicon in the English language to mean any reliable marker of group membership. So, to continue on this kind of rather sad or unfortunate note, a lot of research has been done on particularly racial bias in Western societies like Canada, the United States, and Europe, where social scientists have been particularly interested to discover whether systemic racial bias exists inside institutions. So this is something that's quite different from saying, are there racist people or prejudiced people? We know there are, right? We know this is a problem. But the question that social scientists have been really eager to try to answer in the past 30 or 40 years, even earlier, has been, can we identify a kind of systematic way in which institutions, civic institutions like, for example, the justice system, tend to adopt a racial bias in their dealings with individuals who either are accused of crimes or in other ways kind of interact with these systems. And there's a lot of evidence, the preponderance of evidence to say, indeed, this is the case. That given an equal scenario in which, let's say, for example, a white or an indigenous person are facing the same set of accusations on a number of different levels, from the judge to the representation by public defenders, down through the actual law enforcement agents who had made the interdiction in the first place, we can see racial prejudice or differences in treatment at every level, right? And we've controlled for this. These studies are blind studies in which there's control groups to really give them evidentiary heft. So this is really, sad. Maybe people of color in this class will already know this or have had people talk about it to them or have had some experiences in which this seems to be the case. We can say that this seems to be less true of certain education institutions. However, there are educational institutions in which the outcomes are similar to scenarios like in the justice system. And the fact of the matter is that as a society, as a people, as a group, we have a lot of work to do. There is a lot of work to do. The question, though, that interests us in this class is, does this mean that humans are hardwired to be racist? We know that we have these emotional matrices, these emotions inside of ourselves that push us towards certain kinds of moral decision making. We're establishing that through Green and through other readings that we'll look at in this class. So does that mean, and we know also that humans have an innate tendency to separate ourselves, to sort ourselves, this is called assortment, into in-groups and out-groups. Do those two facts that we know about ourselves and each other, do they necessarily mean that humans are hardwired to be racist? And it's an extremely important question because at the very least, it seems that there is evidence, powerful evidence of systemic levels of racism in our institutions, which are meant to be and designed to be more fair-minded. But these biases persist. And there is some good news on this front, which is that the answer to whether or not humans are innately racist appears to be no. So we've tested for this in a number of different ways, but basically, to kind of sum it up in a very simplistic way. We've tested to see if the category of race is any more biased than any other category of us versus them. So, in other words, cognitive scientists have created tests in which bias would be possible just by putting different team jerseys on two groups and saying, okay, you're part of this team now, and here's a controversial sports call. Was this guy offsides? Did the puck cross the goal line? And what we can tell is, bias exists for sure. In other words, people who identify as part of a team or as a fan of a certain team reliably see the same series of events differently from those who are fans of or associate with the other team. And there are different ways in which social scientists have categorized this, right? That bias is no greater or less than the same level of bias that people apply to those who are of a different racial category than themselves. What this means, and this is in keeping with lots of findings about genetics and different patterns of peoples over time in our evolutionary past, which is to say that humans have all different kinds of skin tones, that we've constantly been migrating into different territories inhabited by people who have different tones of skin, different eye color, hair color, etc. And what we believe now is that race is not a deep evolutionary category, meaning that we don't really see race beyond a sort of shallow version of us versus them, right? So that's kind of where race lives, at the same level as the Toronto Maple Leafs versus the Montreal Canadiens. At that level of, superficiality, but also of bias, right? So if we, for example, were to organize our society more around who's a fan of the Habs and who's a fan of the Leafs, right, you would see the same levels of systemic bias in the justice system against Leafs fans. So in the final analysis here, we have both good and bad news. The good news is we are not attached to race so strongly in terms of our prejudices and biases. The bad news is we seem to have a tendency to create in-groups and out-groups, no matter what the categories are. They could be pretty arbitrary, like sports, like fans of sports teams. But this tendency to create in-groups and out-groups seems to persist across many different cultural scenarios and many different historical scenarios. So we'll examine that a little bit further in the second half of this lecture. See you soon.